Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyukolu. We're speaking, of course, to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. Now, a decisive decade for our world. The words of Joe Biden as he delivered his first speech to the UN General Assembly as President of the United States. Mr. Biden pledged cooperation with America's allies through this decisive decade, but of course his reassurances come amid tensions with allies over the way the US withdrew from Afghanistan and a major diplomatic row with France, as you heard from us a minute ago, over a submarine deal. And there is the US-China rivalry percolating in the background. Mr. Biden campaigned on the theme, America is back, and he has been trying to reaffirm that message at the UN, insisting that the world must work together like never before.
Will we work together to save lives, defeat COVID-19 everywhere, and take the necessary steps to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic, for there will be another one? Or will we fail to harness the tools at our disposal as the more virulent and dangerous variants take hold? Will we meet the threat of the challenging climate we're all feeling, already ravaging every part of our world with extreme weather? Or will we suffer the merciless march of ever-worsening droughts and floods, more intense fires and hurricanes, longer heat waves, and rising seas? Will we affirm and uphold the human dignity and human rights under which nations in common cause more than 7 decades ago formed this institution? Will we apply and strengthen the core tenets of the international system, including the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as we seek to shape the emergence of new technologies and deter new threats? Instead of continuing to fight the wars of the past, we are fixing our eyes on devoting our resources to the challenges that hold the keys to our collective future. We've ended 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan, and as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy, of using the power of our development aid to invest in new ways of lifting people up around the world, of renewing and defending democracy, of proving that no matter how challenging or how complex the problems we're going to face, government by and for the people is still the best way to deliver for all of our people.
President Joe Biden giving his first address to the United Nations as U.S. President. Well, Arise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham has been listening in to President Biden's speech and following developments at the United Nations General Assembly, and he joins me now from Washington. Thank you so much for joining us, Eric. Busy day for you, no doubt, so thank you for slotting us in, as it were. A lot of noise made about hope and good news and rallying the world there from Joe Biden. Tell us what you made of his first address to the United Nations.
What we saw was a president who was actually moving the United States back into the frame or the framework that the United States has operated in for the last 60 to 70 years. I spoke to an ambassador, former Ambassador Ruben Brigady, who was the ambassador to the African Union, and he used the analogy of the American football, where he said foreign policy is played within the 40-yard line on a football field. And he said that's where the United States has operated. And he said during the Trump administration, the United States moved away from that. And what we saw today from Joe Biden speaking at the United Nations, we saw him moving back to that framework, a framework that engages its allies, a framework that upholds the multilateral institutions that the United States was integral in organizing and leading, a framework that sees the United States leading on many of the world's intractable challenges, a framework that sees human rights and diplomacy at the forefront of them. That's what we saw from President Biden. We saw a move from America first to the United States engaging with the rest of the world. And that's the message that the president wanted to leave with those dignitaries today at the United Nations. And that is the integral part of what his agenda is, leading, of course, with the issue of climate change and confronting, tackling, and ultimately defeating COVID-19.
Well, I mean, it's all right for him to give a rousing speech, which it clearly was, but how does all this preparatory diplomacy actually work? Because, I mean, it's pretty difficult, isn't it, to pin nations down on something like, you know, addressing the issue of climate change, even though it is in everyone's interest to do so.
That's absolutely right. And what the president was doing was the president was not only pressing other nations to move on the issue, he was also leading by example, saying that the United States is also reducing its carbon emissions by 2030 and wants to be a net zero carbon emitter by 2050. He talked about how the United States is not only recognizing the ills of the pandemic and future pandemics, but he also showed that the United States is continuing to donate tens of millions of vaccines to poor and underdeveloped countries as well. In fact, the president is going to have more to say about that tomorrow at a meeting on this issue when the White House convenes a group of world leaders on the issue of COVID-19. So what we see here is not only a president recognizing and suggesting here are issues, here are problems, and we need to confront them, but also the United States is leading. In fact, if we talk about the issue of Iran, the president recognizes that he wants to bring Iran back to the table, back to the JCPOA agreement, but he also made clear that the United States is willing and prepared to also not only enter into the agreement, but also honor the terms laid out by the agreement. So what we see is a president who is willing to move in hopes of also moving the rest of the world.
Well, I guess at the heart of it, what's needed is for someone like the US to show leadership, which hopefully will catch on with other countries. But the US also clearly, given the years, as you correctly pointed out, the years of Donald Trump, the US also has to show that it's not being a hypocrite, and it can't be seen to be rowing back on some of the promises, especially after the Trump era.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, he talked about how countries will have tremendous disagreements, but also they should not allow those disagreements to stop them from working on bigger issues. And one example of that we have seen from the United States is its a vast and intense disagreements with China. We know that the United States and China is locked into an intense economic battle right now. But one area where they were able to find common ground is on the issue of climate change, the establishment of a working group between the two largest global economies on climate change, even though we see they continue to lock battles on many other issues. And so, of course, we know with this president, he recognizes that there is a big picture and that there are goals and challenges that need to be met, and there are solutions to be had. And what we're seeing from this president is a steely focus on trying in every way possible to meet those goals, to meet those aims. But also what we're seeing is the president is also attempting to meet them at home. And he talked about this, that, you know, there are tremendous issues and problems that the United States has at home. And that's why we see a president who is trying to address them, of course, with this $3.5 trillion infrastructure package that will meet the issues of rural communities through broadband, providing a free college tuition for community college, child care for women and children, as well as other aims and issues that will meet working class and low income class communities that have been left out of the economy, that have been left out of the opportunities for decades.
And of course, one of the really crucial elements, you talked quite a lot about climate change there, which is one of his pet projects. But one of the really crucial elements in the global battle against climate change is putting money on the table. So ratcheting up the finance is going to be a crucial game changer, isn't it? What did he say about money?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And of course, we know money is the thing that makes us talk, that makes things go, right? And what we are seeing from this president is he talked about, a $15 billion investment in climate change, and he also talked about an additional $40 billion package. And he mentioned the Quad nations that are going to meet. This will be the first time these countries will meet in person, and this is going to take place at the White House. So again, what we're seeing here is a president who is using all the tools of the toolkit. And also, here's something else, Charles, when we talk about money. The president has said that the United States is, for the first time in the 20th century, not engaged in war, and that we cannot continue to confront these problems with guns and bullets. And now what we're seeing is an investment, real monetary, financial investment, moving resources from military and defense operations to diplomatic operations and development. And so what we're going to see from this administration is a robust ramping up of developmental and diplomatic aid that typically has been used on spending towards guns and bullets. And so I think that's what we saw from this president, and it has also been reflected in the president's budget.
That's a crucial point you made there, Eric, and that's one that we're all going to hearken to as the days go forward. But in another sense, the good news is by way of Mr. Biden basically doing what the US promised to do, which is paying its share. But that, in its own way, after the Trump era, is quite an achievement, isn't it?
You're right. And again, we're seeing an administration that is moving back to a place that the United States and the rest of the world has been comfortable with, where the United States is seen as a lead facilitator. One of the major advantages of the United States is its ability to bring nations together. And what we saw over the last 4 years was an administration that was attempting to reshape the geopolitical landscape, to attack many of these multilateral frameworks that have not only governed the West, but governed the world for years. We saw President Trump attacking institutions like NATO. But what we're seeing from the Biden administration is an administration that seeks to work within these frameworks and to address many of the problems, not tear them down. And that's what this administration appears to be committed to. And that's what the administration, and that's what this president was speaking to today for the first time on that stage to these world leaders, is that the United States will be a partner. And that's what he wanted. That was his message. And that's what he wanted the key takeaway to be, that the United States is back, but also the United States is speaking both with its resources, with its might, and with its reputation.
And briefly, Eric, we've got about 30 seconds or so. Inevitably, of course, with things like, climate change, it's about self-interest, isn't it? Because, climate change is something that cuts across every sector.
You're right. And it goes beyond the self-interest, because we see how storms and wildfires are ravaging not only the United States, but the rest of the world. And the president recognizes that it's going to take an entire global community to be able to confront these problems, not just the United States, but all nations.
Well, stay with us, Eric. We're enjoying talking with you so much, and your analysis is just so brilliant. Would like to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more, including protests at the UN headquarters in New York over the continued deportation of Haitians at the US-Mexico border. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyekulu. Now, images and videos which have been posted online appear to show US guards using horse reins to intimidate people attempting to cross from Mexico into the United States at the southern border there. The incident apparently happened near the city of Del Rio in Texas, where thousands of migrants, mostly from Haiti, have set up camp. Now, the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas says that his department is going to investigate reports that Haitian migrants have been abused by those border guards on horseback. However, he did underline that the Haitians would be deported. It comes as Haitian Americans and their supporters have congregated outside the UN headquarters in New York to protest against the deportations and to call for a humanitarian moratorium. Well, for more on this, our correspondent, US correspondent Eric Ham is still with me from Washington. Thank you, Eric, for staying with us. We deeply appreciate it. What's the latest on the plight of those Haitian migrants on the US-Mexico border?
Well, Charles, the deportations are continuing. In fact, there are 7 flights that are scheduled tomorrow to take hundreds of those Haitians that are still on the Mexico-Texas border by the Rio Grande River back to Haiti. And we're already beginning to hear from some of those Haitians that have been deported back to Haiti. They speak of being in a place that they don't know, that they don't understand, and that they don't recognize. In fact, many of them are saying that given the current situation in Haiti right now, they believe that the deportation back to Haiti is an actual death sentence for them. Because, again, we're talking about a country that has been racked by another massive earthquake, as well as a country that continues to be ravaged by COVID, as well as continued government instability. And quite frankly, given those images that we're seeing and the United States history of race relations, already we're seeing a lot of heat being placed on the Biden administration. In fact, yesterday, the White House press briefing was very tense with some very difficult questions for White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki as to these images that were shown of Texas Rangers and U.S. government officials using whips to corral and beat back many of these Haitians trying to cross into the United States.
Yes, and let me take you up on that point, because I mean we're just looking a moment ago as you spoke of those images of Border Patrol guards on horseback. I mean, forcing back Haitian migrants with whips. I mean, how much shock and anger have those scenes caused in America?
Tremendous, Charles, tremendous. In fact, they look like images from 1820 or 1720 and not 2021. And we're seeing now that, the White House has already taken so much heat for its stance, its policies, the situation at the border. This is just another in a long line of problems at the border that are continuing to perplex and vex this administration on this issue. And Charles, the fact that the United States has always had a very disruptive history, particularly with Haitians attempting to try to cross into the United States. We know that the United States has aggressively patrolled the Atlantic waters off of Florida to try to keep Haitians from coming into the United States illegally. Now the fact that they are crossing into the U.S. from Mexico, again, and now we're seeing these deportations, which is very striking, Charles, because we saw the United States airlift over 100,000 Afghans to many parts of the world, many of them actually coming to the United States. But then now you see these deportations of how the United States is aggressively moving these Haitians out of this small area in Texas. And many are saying, again, this is a racial issue. And this is, again, another aspect of U.S. Having just a 10-ear, particularly when it comes to its treatment of Latin immigrant or illegal immigrants coming across the border versus those of Black Haitian descent.
And the Biden administration has said it'll investigate. I mean, the White House spokesman, you mentioned Jen Psaki, called the images horrible to watch. I mean, is there some consolation from what she said?
No, Charles, there isn't in terms of what we are seeing and how this is playing out. And Charles, again, the United States has not been able to really get a handle on this. We have heard from the White House that they are working with Haiti, but right now we know Haiti is, by all intents and purposes, a failed state. And so the fact that they are sending many of these Haitians, who quite frankly, Charles, have been away from Haiti for years now. In fact, many of these Haitians that are being sent back to Haiti left Haiti in the wake of that devastating earthquake of 2010. So it's been over a decade that many of them have been gone from Haiti, and now to basically plop them back into an environment that is so distraught for them, it's only making the situation increasingly worse for them. But again, these images, they don't help the Biden administration, particularly when he is at the UN speaking about trying to work with the rest of the world. And then you see these shocking images, which again, the United States history on race has been known globally. It does very little to advance the credibility of the United States when you see these images.
And I mean, Erica, are there any moves being made at all to perhaps go to court and try and get the administration to stop these deportations? Or is it just dependent on their sort of goodwill and sort of generosity of spirit?
Well, Charles, this has already been adjudicated in court. If we go back to 2020, the Trump administration was given legal rights to be able to deport people without going through the asylum process because of the pandemic. And that actual law was upheld by the Supreme Court just recently because the Biden administration did attempt to do this. Now, Charles, what is taking place now is for unaccompanied minors, even Haitian minors, they are still allowed to remain in the United States as well as families. So they are allowed to remain and actually go through the asylum process. But we also just heard from the Biden administration that they are actually going to increase the cap of those immigrants that are allowed to stay in the United States. But nevertheless, Charles, when it comes to these Haitian immigrants along the Rio Grande in particular, we're seeing an aggressive deportation of many, if not all of them, back to Haiti.
So, I mean, while condemning the incident that we saw of those border guards on horseback riding down the immigrants, the Biden administration is also warning Haitians that, not to attempt to reach that migrant camp in Del Rio in Texas. Basically, it's a tough situation for those people. I mean, I wonder if this is having any effect, any impact at all. I mean, do African Americans in the US see this as something against, black people, or is it specifically against Haitians? Because, I mean, a lot of black votes got Joe Biden into the White House.
No, this is something that I think people of color, particularly black people, when you look at those images, it's hard not to see, the history and the ancestral history, particularly of African Americans. And also, Charles, I just want to point out that it's not just U.S. government border agents, but also Mexico border officials are also telling many of these Haitians to actually go back to Mexico. So what we're seeing, though, are those that are attempting to get in the United States, but also you've got both Mexican officials and U.S. officials attempting to tell them to go back. But if they actually do arrive in the United States and touch U.S. soil, they are rounded up and deported back to Haiti.
Eric, thanks very much indeed. We appreciate your analysis and the time that you've given us. Eric Ham, Arise US correspondent, talking to me from Washington. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and around the world, bye-bye and thank you for watching.